Hi, everybody. Welcome to this week's edition of Daily Kos, The Brief. I am Markos. I am flying solo today. Daily Kos, The Brief is our weekly show about politics, but today it's a show about the Ukrainian war. Today's show, I promise you, is going to make you the smartest person in the room when talking about the Ukraine. And I have two incredible guests today, and let's bring them on right here at the top. First up is Jon Soltz. He is the chairman of VoteVets, which advocates for Iraq and Afghanistan veteran community. He served 2 tours in Iraq, including a stint as a logistics officer. And you know that's going to be a big topic of discussion today. He also served in Kosovo as a tank platoon leader. We also have Brandon Friedman. Brandon is the co-founder of Rakistan Tea Company, a Dallas-based business that promotes peace and development by importing and selling premium tea grown solely in current and post-conflict countries. He has worked with Julian Castro, Tammy, Duckworth, and VoteVets, actually. Brandon served 2 combat tours as an officer with the Army's 101st Airborne Division in Iraq and Afghanistan. He's also the author of the combat memoir, The War I Always Wanted. Jon and Brandon, thanks so much for joining us. Thanks for being here. Kind of wish that we didn't have to talk about this terrible war, but it is. I mean, we're seeing history sort of play out in front of us, and it's giving us almost shades, I think, of 1991 when the Soviet Union collapsed. Right, this idea that you have this unstoppable force, this global superpower, and suddenly it just starts crumbling before our eyes. And I know both you guys have been tweeting and writing about how surprisingly poor the invasion has gone from the beginning. And just for context, we have, you had 180,000 Russian troops. Not sure if all of them are actually combat. There's a lot of support troops in that number, but 180,000 troops. But they've come in from about 15 different directions, in 4 major, 4 major axes. So you're splitting that up. And Ukrainian resistance has held up. This is going to be sort of a free-range discussion, but Jon, let's just kick it off. What has most surprised you about how this war has shaped out in these first few days? Is Jon not hearing us? Brandon, Brandon, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay. What surprised you most about the start of this war?
Yeah, sure. So first of all, thanks for having me on. I think everybody has sort of been shocked at the lack of competence on the part of the Russian military. I think everybody sort of expected something different here. There was sort of a sense, I think, in the 1990s after the Cold War that the Russians weren't that great, but then over the last 20 years, that had kind of changed. They had supposedly modernized their military in terms of equipment, tactics, and all this stuff. And we'd seen them operate a little in Syria, but I don't think anyone expected this performance, which has just been terrible.
I mean, it almost seems like Putin himself didn't know that its military was this poor. I mean, the entire point of this war was for him to say, no, the West can't focus on China. We are a global superpower. Pay attention to us, and we're going to take what's ours.
Yeah.
And almost the exact opposite has come out. Anybody that might be afraid of Russia suddenly is thinking, okay, they got nukes. Let's not pretend that Russia's not incredibly dangerous. Mm-hmm. But maybe they're not as fearsome as we thought.
Yeah, they don't appear to be. They don't appear to be able to come. We talk about the combined arms fight in the military, and they don't appear to be able to do that.
What is the combined?
Yeah, I mean, you got to be able to leverage, air power, sea power, land power, and within land power, you've got to be able to leverage artillery with armor and infantry, and combine those all so that they, operate at the same time efficiently, and they don't seem to be able to do that.
Yeah, Jon, do we have you?
I'm here, man.
Oh, great. So we're sort of just talking broadly speaking about the start of the conflict and just the myth of Russian power, right? Like Putin thought he was going to be, look at me, don't look at China. Like I'm a global superpower,
Right.
hear me roar. And then you have Russian POWs crying, right? It just
Right.
sort of shatters this entire myth. And so Brandon was talking about, sorry, they can't get their, combined arms operation put together. So let me ask you this, Jon. You're coming in from Belarus, from Belarus. How do you organize an invasion that would strike at Kyiv?
Yeah. Let me back up the one thing, Markos, because there's a reason that the American military felt this way about Russia, right? Part of it is what they did in Georgia. George Bush let them basically go into Georgia uncontested.
Georgia in Asia, not Georgia.
Yes. Yeah, of course.
Not our Georgia.
Right. Barack Obama essentially let them just have Crimea, right? We saw them use sea fires with maneuver in Syria. We've seen them use drones and artillery fires in Donbass. And in reality, when you go out to the Army training center sites like that scared the shit out of us. The fact that they were able to send drones 2 clicks into Ukraine and use rocket systems to take out artillery battalions was a shot across the bow. And as you saw U.S. forces become experts on counterinsurgency in Iraq or Afghanistan, you saw an uptick in, Russian maneuver, the Russian army, at some level it was rebuilt. So at some level, we've seen them do some proficient warfighting functions, right? There's 6 basic warfighting functions that the U.S. Army uses: information operations, command and control, maneuver, fires, sustainment, and force protection. And so if you can do those things together, you win. At least we do. And we saw them begin to do fires and maneuver. We saw it in Syria.
Can we explain what each one of those elements is?
Yeah, so command and control is like we call it C2. It's your command structure. And when you're dealing with the Russian military, the command structure is at the top, right? It's same with the Iraqi army. When I trained the Iraqi army, there was no look. You don't. It's unlike the American military where we have depth of leadership everywhere. I mean, they're always afraid of a coup. So command and control is very centralized. So if you knock off the head of it, it's over. So when you look at what we saw in Donbass, or you look at what we saw in Syria, you had a very linear C2 structure right to the top, where it was a limited amount of troops doing these things. When they open it up, they can't do it. When you talk about
opening it up, you're talking about multiple fronts.
Like 100,000 troops, right? Versus like 3,000 doing something in special forces. So when you look at maneuver and fires, right? Maneuver is like your infantry and your armor, and how do they operate with fires? Well, very different from the American Army. The American Army uses maneuver, right? They use fire to support maneuver, right? So we're gonna call in fire to assist our maneuver elements.
And fire is artillery,
right? Russia's
and
opposite.
Air power, and
Russia uses their maneuver to protect their fires because they level cities in World War II, and that's always been a basic doctrinal difference. Sustainment, of course, we've all seen. I mean, they have all the gas in the world, but they can't move it. So when you look at all of these,
logistics.
Sustainment is logistics, right? And so they've struggled there, but there was real reason to look at what had happened in Donbass and what had happened with drones and fires in the eastern part of Ukraine for the last 6 years that scared us out at Army training centers. Like they used naval sea fires with maneuver in Syria. But when they bring it all together at one time with 100,000 troops, they're really struggling, right? So you bring up how would you go about this attack? And would you come in from Belarus? Look, the Belarus line of communication to me has never made sense. And when we went over this at War College, it's like, look, if you're Russia, you want to stay in the terrain where the Russian population is. So in my opinion, if I was in charge of the Russian army, you would have come from the east or from Crimea, and you would have met, and you would have created a land bridge where you have the Russian population. And you would have used that to get the negotiated response that you want from Ukraine, which is, I don't want you a part of NATO, which is the strategic objective. I don't want the open door policy. Instead, they chose 3 lines of effort, right? One from the south, one from the east, and one from the north. And now they have to protect that. And that's very complicated. When we went into Iraq, we had 2. It was really 1 1/4 because we airborne dropped the 173rd in. So, when you have all these lines of effort, now you have to provide force protection and sustainment and all these different things. And so they have we would say in the American Army, an operational design problem, right? And their strategic objectives are not linked with, tactical and operational objectives that are going to achieve that goal. So I know Putin's upset right now. I know he's scared. I know he thinks he's in trouble, so he wants to bomb these cities. But, there's design flaws here that, the American press should hold on to and say, Putin's in deep shit. Okay. And we shouldn't let him off the hook here and make this army look like it's anything more than a disorganized piece of chaos right now on the ground.
Yeah. So one of the earliest signs that maybe Russia was going to be in trouble is this airborne assault at the international airport right outside of Kyiv, where they seemed to just drop them and with no sign of support or anything, and they ended up getting wiped out within a day. Brandon, you were in an airborne division whose job is to do this kind of operation. So you're looking at that. What was your take on that operation, and what would U.S. Army would have done different?
Yeah. So it looked to me from what I've heard about that operation was that all they did was drop paratroopers on an airfield. It didn't look like, I saw no evidence that they had Pathfinders on the ground, that they dropped Pathfinders in to
And what would Pathfinders do?
Establish the drop zone.
Okay.
And they can also communicate if there's security issues. Like there's a Ukrainian battalion right there, stuff like that. And it doesn't look like they did that. They have never had control of the airspace. And you want control of the airspace before you drop paratroopers on an airfield. It doesn't look like they had the intel to determine what Ukrainian forces were in the vicinity, because it sounds like as soon as they dropped these guys, like they got rolled up really rapidly.
Wouldn't they assume that there's going to be resistance? That was the first
sign for me.
Yeah, you would think they would assume that there would be resistance.
There's so many times there's. Well, you would think that they would assume there's going to be resistance so that they would prepare for it, because even if there's going to be, a seizure of an airfield is a forcible seizure, so you can expect resistance to still do it, but you got to prepare. You have to have the intel that tells you what's on the ground, what you're going to be facing, what you're going to need to do that. They had no support for this. They dropped these guys, and then the Ukrainian army just rolled them up. And I don't know all the details. I don't know if they killed them or took them prisoner, but that was the first sign for me that something was not right, because the U.S. military would never, ever, in this day and age, drop paratroopers to seize an airfield when there's a chance for failure.
They're surrounded by hostile territory. They're surrounded by people with surface-to-air missiles, so any supply operations are threatened. There's no land links to supply them. And when we talk about supply, and so people understand this, ammunition, food, equipment, because equipment breaks down.
Yeah.
So they were left, and so they handed Ukraine an easy propaganda victory. Here they are under intense assault on everybody's thinking Kyiv's going to fall within 24 hours. That was that first day, right? It seemed like, and because I think there's still this myth of this competent Russian army, and of course they're only 100 kilometers away. They're going to roll in, and then they pull that off, and then I think that sends a message to the Ukrainian military that, oh my God, these guys this is VDV, this is elite Russian forces, not conscripts.
Yeah,
and we just rolled them.
Yeah, and I think John made a really good point the other day about 72 hours being sort of the I don't remember what you call it, the golden point in terms of logistics, and that's true. Infantry, armor troops that are on the move in combat generally will carry about 3 days worth of supplies, food, water, ammunition, and you need to be resupplied. And after the first 3 days of this, it was very clear that they didn't have they didn't have those supply lines established to resupply these guys. And that was when you saw people start, Russian troops start to abandon tanks and stuff like that.
Yeah, John, why are logistics important? Like what?
Yeah.
And you did this, right? And this is incredibly complex. And
that is my real profession, right? Military logistics is my real profession. And I started off in armor, and because I was in armor, I used to, I always joke with Brandon because he's a 101st guy, but when I was a cadet, I went to airborne school and I thought I was so cool. But you watch World War II and you see the 101st in Bastogne, and that's a perfect example of being surrounded without logistics, right? You see Arnhem and the bridge too far in Battle of Market Garden, where the armor could not get up the road to airborne paratroopers, and they ended up, the British troops were beat up pretty good. So whenever you drop folks in, you got to get logistics there, right? We almost dropped 2nd Brigade at 82nd into BIOP in 03 in Baghdad, but we were nervous. We could not get there to give them support. So logistics starts to play a role. For airborne logistics, it's a little bit different. It's light logistics, so it's at some level easier for us, right? But you have to get there to create that line of communication. For us, if we were going to go in, if we were to send a division in, right, that would carry 3 days of support with it. We would refuel them at the line of departure, so they leave with 72 hours of fuel. But what would happen on that route, we call them main supply routes, MSRs, we would dominate that road. So we would use air cover like helicopters. We would have MPs on that road, and we would leave the engineer battalion or the engineer assets or a maneuver brigade to do rear area security. Like, this is just basic TTP maneuvers that we do in the American Army.
All right, TPP. We're gonna have to.
Train, just basic training, training standard operating procedures. So now you have a road that maybe for 60 miles is completely secure, right? We've got infantry outside the road, so you can, you could send mechanized columns up it. Armor cannot move without infantry, right? That's why you see these javelins working so well. So imagine a road that's
This is a good point, though. Why can armor not move without infantry? This is a critical point because it's one of the biggest failings of this attack right now.
Yeah, because the armor columns and the truck convoys are stuck on the middle of the road, and there's nobody protecting, a quarter mile out. I mean, those javelins can hit you from like two kilometers. So
I mean, we've seen guys with RPGs taking out, because there's no infantry. And I just think people should realize when you're in one of those tanks or armored personnel carriers, you can't see shit. Like, your visibility is severely restricted. That gun's not going to take out infantry. It's a big gun. It's designed to take out other tanks or other armored vehicles. Maybe there's a machine gun, 50 cal, whatever the Russian equivalent is, at the top of it, but they're really blind around them. So infantry actually protects the heavy armor on its flanks.
And sustainment. And so now you look at, imagine a corridor that your sustainment can go up for 25, 30, 40 miles, set up a forward sustainment platform that you can then send the heavy mechanized fuelers back to you, and then they push forward, or you can push forward to them and come back to your base. So that's how we do it, but we've got to create the security for the sustainment to work, because you can't do it. Generally, a heavy brigade combat team at the National Training Center, is going to be 25,000 gallons of fuel every other day, right? That's how much fuel is required in heavy equipment. So light guys is easy. It's
it tanks about what, half a mile per gallon.
So so you have all right. So you've got all these fancy artillery guns. You've got all these, APCs. They have BTRs, BIMPs, and T80s and T72s and whatever. They have old stuff. But if it has no fuel, it's rendered useless, and that's what you start to see. And so when they cannot combine sustainment with maneuver, which we're seeing, they're struggling. They're struggling when they try to put it all together at one time, and you could kind of see the writing on the wall. And I think, Brandon, that's why I was pretty confident that day of, like, you can see what's going to happen here, because they never controlled those roads. And if they can't control those roads, they can't get support up it to back up their people.
Well,
so
there was somebody that said the other day on Twitter, they showed a picture of like an abandoned Russian T-72 tank that had like driven into a ditch. And they said, that's probably pretty easily recoverable. And it's like, yes, it should be easily recoverable. It's normally easily recoverable if you have the infantry to set out security to secure the vicinity of the tank. If you have the engineers who can come in with the heavy equipment and pull it out of the ditch, and you have the air cover, to prevent any other, enemy forces from approaching.
Brandon, the worst argument I've seen on Twitter is the one that shows where U.S. forces were at day 4 in Iraq and where Russian forces are in day 4 in Ukraine. Because, like, we didn't have people deserting. Okay, yeah, of course our maintenance is always a problem, right?
But I want to talk about that a little bit. My experience. But go ahead.
we control battle space. Like, you don't want to move too fast that you can't control what's behind you. And the truth was, when there was a sandstorm in 03, that was a really good, that was a moment for us to resupply ourselves. When you look at 96 hours in the Gulf War, we were out of fuel. So we also have these challenges in mechanized fight. But the idea that you can compare 03 and the U.S. invasion to what you're seeing in Russian army, to me, is a total historical revision. And that sort of gets under my skin when I see it on Twitter, because it's a completely ridiculous comparison at this point.
Well, everybody that was an expert epidemiologist over the last 2 years is now an expert tactician. So
Yeah.
it's the nature of Twitter. So I was MLRS. I was multiple launch rocket system, rocket artillery. These horrible barrages you're seeing, particularly in Kharkiv, because that artillery doesn't have supply issues. They're literally sitting on is it Belarus or Russian territory? I think it's Russian territory. So that's why that city is getting pummeled like no other city right now. That's what I did. And there was 9 rocket launchers, armored, tracked rocket launchers. And I actually had to go back and look to make sure, because I wanted to make sure I remember correctly. Those 9 launchers, we had 63 vehicles in our battery to support 9 launchers. We're talking ammo trucks, 2 fuel trucks, a crane to pull out our vehicles when they ended up in a ditch, which happened a lot. Humvees, command and control vehicles. I was in one of those command and control vehicles, and I was in charge of the logistics for my platoon, which was 3 launchers, and getting fuel, food, mechanics, and mechanics. I mean, we couldn't move 10 miles without something breaking down. This is active duty, constant maintenance. Under the best peacetime conditions, we couldn't get these things. We're looking at Russian armor moving on the streets to get places. They don't even have flatbed trucks to carry them. It's a wonder anything is moving.
Markos, this is a great point with training the Iraqi and Afghan armies. My second tour in Iraq, I was doing it. At the very last thing I was involved with was foreign military sales in Taji. And, we were giving them M1s. And I'm like, listen, I'm a heavy brigade combat team logistician. Like, you're talking about a supply chain that goes back to the States. We have a hard time with a highly educated military, right? And I know people think maybe that's different, but the truth is that 10% of the Afghan army was literate, right? So of sustainment and keeping maintenance going with our own advanced weaponry. And so it was the whole AK-47 versus M4 scenario. Give them AKs because they don't have to maintain it. When you get
the
into
AK is a venerable old Russian rifle that you can drag it through mud and the thing will work.
Yeah, you're better off to give them things they can sustain and manage on their own than providing the Western way of war, and that gives them a fighting chance. And so that's why we say logistics wins wars. And it's you can see the amount of time and effort we put into it in the American Army that you really got to be proficient at sustainment. And without it, I got to tell you, the Russians are lucky that the United States isn't involved. I mean, this show would have been over. Like, there's no second chances for these kids. And I will tell you, like, I do feel bad for the conscripts because we are learning here that conscription may not be the 21st century way of war. It just, and people always say, should there be a draft in the American Army during Iraq? The answer is no, right? Because you've got to have people that want to fight. You've got to have people that want to be there. And I take some sympathy in these Russian soldiers who, literally didn't know where they were going, which isn't surprising considering the fact that they limit the amount of information they pass down, and they have no non-commissioned officer corps to lead these kids.
Yeah, I mean, I've even seen Twitter threads where they're using unsecured civilian walkie-talkies to communicate. So there's this whole crew now that have come up with civilians that are intercepting this information, translating it, getting information to relevant Ukrainian units, but they're also getting an insight. They're hearing Russian soldiers crying while they're under assault, and it's I gotta say I'm more sympathetic for Russians now than I had been almost ever, which is really ironic given the horror of what's happening, because you realize how much of it is just driven by Putin and how these people really had no interest. But that also means that's what's so dangerous about artillery, because they don't know what they're firing. They may be told that they're firing on army barracks. And so it's a different, you almost see the difference, right? The artillery is just, that seems to be doing a really good job, effective, of doing the typical Russian thing, flattening things.
Yeah,
while
it takes that human element out of it, Markos. You don't see what you're doing. You don't see, like when you're doing MLRS and you're shooting, 20 clicks, you don't see it. It's not in your face.
This is why it's going to be a really, really big shock to these guys once they get inside Kyiv.
Brandon, I was about to ask that question because you just did a Twitter thread today that was excellent that said, if you were Russia on that trail down to Kyiv, I would turn around and go back. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. No, I would turn around and go right back the way I came, because So Russia's eventually going to be able to overpower the Ukrainian army when it comes to breaking into the cities. Just by sheer brute force, they will. But then once they get in there, then they have to sustain themselves, and they have to pacify the population, and they have to be able to set up some form of governance and all this stuff. They're not going to be able to do that because everyone in Kyiv hates them. And it's going to become a living nightmare for these guys once they get inside the city. You know, I don't know if you guys have seen A Bronx Tale. There's a scene where these bikers go to break up a bar, and these mob guys ask them to leave, and they say they're not going to leave. And so the guy goes over there and he closes the door to the bar, he locks it, and he says, "Now you can't leave." And then they come in and beat these guys about to death. And I always think about that because it's, you know, once the Russian troops get into Kyiv, they're going to be trapped, and they're not going to be able to leave. And it's going to be an absolute nightmare of an insurgency against these guys. Because one thing I always talk about was that in Iraq and in Baghdad, there was never a point at which more than 1% of the population was willing to pick up arms and fight the American troops or the Iraqi government forces. And that's a lot. You know, in the city of Baghdad with 6 million people, that's still 60,000 people. But it was never more than that. You know, it was never more than 1%. You're looking at Kyiv, where there's going to be 10, 15, 20% of the population is going to take up arms against you. So whatever we saw in Fallujah, Ramadi, Baghdad, you're looking at probably 10 to 20 times the number of fighters that you're facing. And you're not only going to be, in what we were facing in Iraq, we were facing Iraqis that had old Iraqi military weaponry. And in some cases, they were reinforced by Iranian weapons. Okay, that's bad, but it's not nearly as bad as being reinforced by, when you're facing a force that's being reinforced by NATO weaponry and Javelins and, you know, communications equipment and all this stuff. It's just going to be a nightmare for the Russians. And they're going to be facing a population where a high percentage hates them. A high percentage is going to be willing to take up arms, and they're angry. It's going to be a hornet's nest. And it's not going to look like Iraq or Afghanistan.
This is the point, Brandon. I agree with you that I'm not seeing it on the cable shows, right? And the truth is, like, if you don't actually want to take Kiev right now, like, you don't want it, like, you do not want it, because again, if your strategic objective is to keep Ukraine away from NATO and destroy the open door policy and get a puppet government, how is what you're doing achieving that objective? But I 100% agree with you, because I always said, you know, maybe in Baghdad it was like 40-60 against us, 50-50, whatever it was. And then there's the people that fight against you. They go into that city, let them have it. Like, everyone's like, oh my God, the convoy. I don't like that. I mean, like, dude, like, there is no way for Russia to win this war. I don't care how many buildings they knock down. I don't care how many casualties, you know, Ukraine takes. Like, they are going to win this war, because the goals that Putin has, you know, pushed are not achievable. And
what are those?
Level,
there's two goals. You've written about those two goals.
Well, I mean, look, he does not like this open door policy. He does not want Ukraine a part of NATO like Latvia, Lithuania, and Estonia. He does not want that, right? Because he wants to, you know, get back to the place he was. So his concept was, let me intimidate, you know, people and keep NATO away from Ukraine. To do that, he wants to put a puppet regime in there, right? That was the whole Manafort kind of, you know, he was working for the Russian puppet regime and all that stuff. But the point still is, if you take Kiev at this point, because they didn't surrender like he thought. I mean, he thought he'd walk in, they'd surrender. You're grabbing the tiger by its tail, and you're looking at some type of operation that is going to be brutal. And I think that's why we're seeing the shift in strategy or tactics today, to just be like, let's go back to blowing cities up, because might be Putin's best chance to get some type of negotiated, you know, end state that he doesn't look completely like an idiot, you know. But I will tell you, for people that watch this, if you're watching TV and they're like, oh my God, Kiev's going to be occupied, take it. Like,
they're not taking anything. It's
like you don't want it. You
Yeah.
don't want it because of what Brandon's saying. Like, now you're dealing in an asymmetric 365 battlefield that is where huge percents of the population are armed that want to fight you. And the casualties are going to be substantial for Russia. It might look ugly for a week, but I'm telling you, in the long run, Russia cannot win this war. They cannot win this war at the goals the way they've established it right now.
There seems there. Go ahead, Brandon.
No, I mean, ultimately the U.S. wasn't. We can argue about the success of the U.S. in Iraq, but ultimately, any success that we did have, or our ability to stay there for so long and help prop up the Iraqi government, was premised on the idea that Iraqis were helping us. Yeah. We hired Iraqis who worked with the U.S. forces from day one. I mean, who wanted to help. There was a huge portion of that population that was happy to have us there and overthrow Saddam. And
100%.
And so the way that what that looks like in real life is, not only do you have people who can interpret for you and translate and help you with stuff, but they can warn you. They can tell you when there's some guys down the road who are planting IDs, or where there's some guys down the road sitting in ambush. The Russians aren't going to have that. No one wants to help them.
Yeah, 100%.
And it's going to be such a difficult environment in which to operate eventually. And you're already dealing with conscripts who don't want to be there, who didn't think this is what they were going to be doing. It's going to be brutal for them.
So you mentioned, Brandon, earlier the Javelins, and so everybody understands Javelin are anti-tank missiles that, along with British NLAWs, NLAW, have dramatically, I think, shifted the tide of this war, because it allows these cheap missiles to take out Russian armor and trucks and supply, whatever, everything, right? And they're flooding in. And I just saw today that in Western, I mean, unfortunately, you can't airdrop this stuff into Kyiv anymore. It doesn't look like, but the rail network out in Western Ukraine is still intact. Like, this entire logistical chain in Ukraine is in operation. They can still get supplies into Kyiv through land, and that may end, they may get encircled eventually, but it allows them to move supplies to the fighters at the front lines. And that's just, they can't get their own supply lines in shape, but they also haven't taken out Ukraine's supply lines. And you'd think by now they would have control of the skies. And I wonder if they can't even fly these planes. Like they should be swarming like Iraq was in those early days. It was thousands of sorties and cruise missiles. And here we have, I think, 180 cruise missiles in almost a week of war. And, maybe a couple hundred sorties. Do they even have air power? Does that even exist?
I don't know. So a lot of the problems that the Russians have faced are sort of explainable, like we've talked about, with their inability to operate in a combined arms environment. There's a lot of questions that honestly, Markos, I don't think we understand why they're performing so poorly. Like people have talked about the mystery of the missing Air Force. I don't know. No one seems to know where they are. Like, what happened? Like,
in those first early days, you saw in fact in that attack on the airport, there was a swarm of attack helicopters early, but then they seem to be gone. Did they all break down? They had one flight in them.
Yeah, I don't know if they're being shot down, if they just, if they're running out of fuel, if they're running out of armaments. I don't know, but it's just been astonishing to see this.
It's ironic that the saber rattling has now spurred Finland and Sweden, historically neutral countries, to now openly talk about joining NATO at the same time that Russia looks as low as a threat militarily, aside from the nuclear missiles. And so we can't forget.
This is what Jon was talking about with them achieving their strategic objectives. Like, if you want to expand your influence out and push NATO back, all they've done is galvanize Europe. So now instead of keeping Ukraine out of NATO, now you're going to get Ukraine in NATO, and you're going to get Finland and Sweden, and Kosovo's trying to get. Well, I think Kosovo's trying to get involved, and I mean everybody wants in now.
Markos, listen, there was this Ukrainian colonel. We listened to him at War College this summer, and he was like, "Please, we want to be a part of NATO." And I'm like, "No way, dude! They're already in Donbass and they control Crimea." Like, this was a viable opinion at this point. The fear last week was, could they cut off the Suwalki Gap? Like, could they control Ukraine? And then there's a very limited piece of terrain between Kaliningrad and Belarus, right, that we maneuver through to get into the Baltics. If they cut off the Baltics, there's going to be a big war. I mean, this was the line of thought a week ago, that basically everything has backfired on Russia, where Finland and Sweden, who've always been neutral now, are saying, hey, please. But again, the conventional thought a week ago was, how do we get troops in? And listen, Markos, at VoteVets, we took a lot of heat for saying we needed more troops in NATO countries, right? Remember, Obama put them in at the end of his administration. Trump took some of them out. Everyone's like, oh, why didn't anything happen to Trump? We have no idea what was going on between Donald Trump and his conversations with Putin in private. No idea.
Busy getting rid of NATO. He was undermining it. I mean, he was Putin's best wish.
Right. There were progressive Democrats on TV saying there's no military problem here. Look, all my time in the Army, there's not, like Iraq and Afghanistan. You can argue, where's the military solution? When you have 130,000 Russian troops on your border, you have a military problem. And getting NATO troops into NATO countries to sort of stop the bleeding in Ukraine was a good course of action a week ago, so this thing didn't bleed, but the theory was it was going to fall quick and it was going to bleed other places. And that is frightening, because if he did touch Estonia and those Russian populations there, that would obligate us to a conflict that's nuclear. So there was just a lot of concern, and I was frankly anxious about it myself until 24 to 48 hours when this thing started. And you're like, wow, I guess they're not as proficient as we thought.
So historically, Russia doesn't win wars. I mean, it loses a lot of wars, and when it wins, it doesn't do so because of tactics. It does so by overwhelming artillery. You carpet destroy with artillery, then you send infantry in to occupy the rubble. And we saw that in Afghanistan, in Syria, in even Donbass, which is an economic basket case, because Russia doesn't take care of its satellite states and occupied territories. I mean, it lets them rot. And so, and one of you guys, sorry if I don't remember, maybe both of you guys wrote about how at the beginning of the war, it seemed that Russia was holding back on that traditional approach because, the argument was Ukraine is part of Russia. They want us to liberate them. So you wouldn't go in and just basically level entire cities. And obviously that appears to be happening, at least in Kharkiv, which is within easy reach of Russian soil, long-range artillery. So the conflict's a little different than a lot of places because, you've seen civilians block convoys. Like that wouldn't work in Syria. I mean, those civilians would be immediately, eradicated. But it does sort of create some constraints and problems for Russia, right? Trying to claim at the same time that these are our brothers and sisters and they belong to Russian, actually. There's no such thing as Ukraine. They're actually Russian. Then why are you killing them?
Yeah, I mean, it brings up a good point. It negates their argument. We want Ukraine because it's part of Russia. Oh, by the way, we're going to level it and reduce it to rubble. So they've sort of painted themselves into a corner with that.
It's why they should, like, again, it's like for us in Afghanistan. If our objective was to get bin Laden, right? Okay, we didn't have to surge. Obama didn't have to put all those troops in, right? That was a bridge to nowhere. Okay, that was the David Petraeus. We just need a little bit more troops, and we're training the Iraqi army, right, or the Afghan army, and they're almost there. It's, you can see the same stuff filtering up to Putin that maybe is not accurate. But if they had limited their scope and focused on these parts of Ukraine where they would get indigenous Russian population support, like Donbass and Crimea, and they make that land bridge, they could have had a limited operation in Ukraine that would have created problems for Zelensky because they would have been operating in areas where people would have supported them and they would have had a geopolitical argument. Hey, they're not treating Russian minorities correctly. So we came in to help those Russian minorities. By going big, right, not only did Putin create operational challenges that his army wasn't ready for, but he's created geostrategic issues as well because Kiev is not a Russian town, right? So I like to say they overbit, they bit off more than they could chew. But if they had limited it, they would have had, in my opinion, a chance to really, really create more problems.
If you take that Donbass region, if they just focus on that, Europe would have fractured. I mean, Italy,
well, right.
They wanted to sell Gucci to Russian oligarchs, and that was their big thing. They didn't want to give up luxury goods to Russia. Germany, of course,
Everybody would have called it a border dispute, right? That's what you got on Fox News. It was a border dispute. So, again, Russian ethnic minorities being mistreated. This is Kosovo now, right? Albanian majorities being mistreated by a Serbian government, right? You saw it in Macedonia, right? Oh, Albanians being mistreated by a Macedonian government. When you start getting into these nation state dynamics, you can make a real argument that limits international influence based on, border disputes. And Putin overplayed his hand straight up.
So looking at the map of occupied territory right now, one of the things that's so striking is of all the talk of logistical problems, all that occupied territory is hugging friendly territory. There's no real penetration into the center of the country, right? Where you're thinking about hundreds of kilometers of unsecured logistic lines. And, keep coming back to logistics is so critical. But I think it's important to note that all the problems they're having right now, they haven't taken a major city as we're talking about right now. They haven't even taken Mariupol, which is so isolated out in the southeast corner of the country, far away from Kyiv and Ukrainian supply lines, surrounded by hostile territories right south of the Donbas region, which was Russian occupied, literally a stone's throw across a body of water from Russia itself. And it's still in Ukrainian hands as we speak. And eventually it's going to fall. I mean, it has to. I mean, I can't imagine it sticking around. But if they can't handle supply lines now, is there any chance they're going to learn to do this better as they start punching into the middle of the country?
I don't know. I think one of the things with that convoy, there's a couple of theories on that convoy. One is they just
let's talk about the convoy is just from Kiev to the Belarus border in one tight street, all packed in together.
So one of the theories on the convoy was they sent battalions first and smaller elements, right? And then, or it's just wave after wave, right? That's the Soviet way. You send wave after wave. One of the theories on the convoy now is like people got their ass chewed, send it all, right? And so there's a lot of logistics capability in that convoy. So it's like, just send it all. But again, they still don't know how to make cake with the ingredients, And so I have no idea. My opinion is they're not going to figure out sustainment. You're going to see them stealing from Ukrainian gas stations.
That we saw already.
How to do sustainment, right?
Yeah.
But even downtown in Kiev, if they're there, like they're just going to raid grocery stores and take from the civilians because that's, this is the, British military in the Revolutionary War, right? This is why you can't quarter people, And so it's like, I don't know. I mean, I think that we're going to, and as the days go out, maybe the convoy is just a way for Putin to get some leverage, but I kind of think they're just like throw it all together so they're not separate, and because they don't have their sustainment with their maneuver elements at all. And we'll see. I mean, that convoy has a lot of everything. For all we know, it's out of gas too. But I'm not sure they're going to figure out sustainment in a mechanized force overnight. That's not that you're talking PhD level logistics here, and they're in kindergarten on it.
Yeah, it's hard to learn that stuff on the fly.
Yeah.
Is there anything?
I don't know.
Ahead,
no, I just wonder. We were talking about what they should have done, and it's easy to armchair quarterback this or luck in hindsight. But I think back to what the invasion of Iraq looked like and how methodical it was, and how there was one main axis of advance and two supporting axes, one in the north, one to the east. And I just wonder what Ukraine would have looked like if Russia had, instead of doing all the stuff everywhere all at once, chaotically, if they had left Russia and tried to take Kharkiv in the east, which is very close to the Russian border, and what it would look like now if they had massed their forces there, gone into that city, which I assume has a higher Russian population than Kyiv.
It does. Yeah.
And it has, they have a much shorter supply line with that location.
Like 20 kilometers.
Yeah. So you got a much shorter supply line. You're intimidating. It's at the beginning. They probably could have taken that city if they'd massed all those forces and all their air power on that one objective.
Yeah.
So,
Brandon,
what would it look like now? What would it look like now if they had successfully taken Kharkiv? So if 3 days ago they'd taken that city, it's the second largest city in Ukraine. Okay, now the Russians have taken it. Okay, now they're consolidating their power. Now they're going to move. Now they're going to advance forward. Okay, so if you're the Ukrainians, now you're intimidated. Now you're freaked out because they've taken a city, and not everyone in that city hates them because it's got a potentially a friendlier population. But they didn't do that.
There's also, Brandon, there was no linear, like, 3 Ukrainian divisions online in the defense, right? We didn't see that. So if you were going to feint in Donbas, right, which is make the Ukrainians think you're going to attack there and then come from the north, you do that to divide assets. The reason we dropped in the 173rd Airborne Brigade into northern Iraq was simply because we couldn't get 4th ID there. We really wanted 2 main accesses in 03. Yeah. But the Turks wouldn't.
4th Infantry Division is just a larger mechanized armor division.
Yeah, so we wanted to disperse Iraqi units, right? So we didn't have a big fight. There was no like big linear dynamic here to like separate Ukrainian forces. I mean, Ukrainian forces, to their credit, have kind of, not fought face to face online. I mean, they've chipped away at these guys, but there was no reason to use the 3 accesses because there was really nothing preventing you from dominating 1 access, which would have allowed you sustainment. Maybe you go with 2 accesses, but 3 accesses is a lot. I mean, they have more in Ukraine than we had in Iraq. I know Brandon talked about the access from the west and the north, but you're talking like the Ranger battalions to the west, and you're talking a brigade from the north. The real access of advance was from the south, right? That's where the mechanized access was. Multiple, I mean, this is Rommel in the desert in 42 and 43. It's like logistics will. Eventually, the reason we beat the Nazis in North Africa was Rommel ran out of supplies. He couldn't sustain it, But Brandon brings this great point up. There was no reason to divide your forces like that. None. 0.
They could have taken Kharkiv. They could have consolidated there. And then now they look like a beast. Now you've taken the second largest city.
Yeah, you're flexing. You're flexing.
Yeah, you're flexing, and the whole world is sort of on edge. Where are they going to go next? And they could have at that point, then you just go city by city. That's what we did in Iraq. People forget the Iraq invasion by the Americans. No one took Baghdad in the first couple of days. It was very methodical, and it took 3 weeks. Yeah. But the U.S. forces went city by city, and it was methodical, and it was, echelonment of fires and combined arms, and and there was lots of chaos within that, but it was ultimately a very methodical advance up from Kuwait toward Baghdad. And it sort of built steam as it went. So by the time the 3rd Infantry Division crashed into Baghdad, there wasn't as much resistance left.
Brandon, I always think they just thought they were going to thunder run in, and Ukraine was just going to quit. And their
no, they did.
Yeah,
absolutely, they did. They thought they were going to. It's like they looked at the American invasion of Iraq in 2003. They looked at the German Blitzkrieg in World War II, and they were like, "Oh, we got that."
Yeah, as I understand it, the Blitzkrieg though was 3 waves, right? It was you had the mechanized armor come in, spearhead, and then you had infantry, whatever, take and secure the ground behind that spear point, and then there'd be another push, right? That's vaguely how I remember how the German Blitzkrieg happened in World War II. So it was 3 waves. Russia had 1 wave all around, which again speaks to that. And if you even look coming out of Crimea, they split in 2, right? They went, in 2 different directions. And up north, they came out through Chernobyl, and then down the other side with Chermisky, where they're stuck, right? So they again, everywhere else, they have 4 main areas of, attack, but even those are sort of splintered. And so I think somebody counted there's like 15 avenues of attack. So if you have 180,000 troops, that sounds really impressive until you realize you're dividing them by 15. And makes it a lot easier to handle. And then you throw on top the lack of combined arms, no Air Force, weirdly, and supply lines are dying. And so everything sputters. And we're still at the border, basically. We haven't even gotten into the meat of Ukraine. Western Ukraine is fine. Like, trains are running. Like, how's rail not the first thing you take out? Trains are running fine.
The first thing we would have done is we would have knocked the Air Force out, and we would have taken all their airports, and then we would have met people there. We want airports in the American Army because that's how we get logistics in. The Russians, clearly, you guys talked about the air assault, but we would have knocked their aircraft out. That'd have been the first thing to control the skies. And then, we would start like Mariupol when I did the tabletop on the Ukraine invasion 6 months ago. The first thing I did was taking Mariupol because it's a seaport. We're going to take logistics hubs and squeeze you out. But they I don't know. They are struggling. And
now artillery is a problem, though. Is there any scenario that we see that Ukraine can make a dent on that? Those multiple launch rocket systems that are just bombing the crap out of some of those cities?
It depends on how long they can keep their air assets in the air. They've been launching strikes with the Ukrainian Air Force and with drones, with the UAVs. I don't know how long they can keep that going. I mean, eventually they'll start getting shot down, but
they've lost 5 at least of the 15 that they had. So yeah, they're being degraded for sure.
Markos, they have counterbattery. The Ukrainians have counterbattery radar. So the question is like, if the shots are coming from Belarus, it's a different problem, or inside Russia, with the rockets, they can shoot them from a long way away.
Yeah.
But any of their anti-armor equipment will work against those guns. They just have to be able to know where they're at. But they have the radar system to say this is where the shots are fired from. It's a question of, how do you go and take that out? Because you're talking about way back, and being able to like shoot at Kharkiv from outside the Ukrainian borders. That's what makes it complicated.
So unbelievably, we're down to our last 10 minutes. So let's quickly talk about you. If you are a NATO planner and you want Ukraine to hold out the Russians, what are you focused on delivering to the Ukrainian armed forces right now?
You want to go first, Brandon?
I mean, anti-armor, communications equipment, fuel, batteries. There was this story yesterday about how they were going to get some aircraft from the EU. I don't know where that stands. I mean, obviously,
it fell apart. I think Russia threatened and said that if they'll consider it an act of war. So that fell apart.
They're gonna need food, fuel, water, ammunition, and the higher tech stuff like the Javelins, UAVs.
UAVs are the drones, yeah.
Markos, I got to tell you, I'm thinking about how do you take care of the civilians?
Yeah.
Because if they want to fight, like, look, we're talking about the president of Afghanistan got on a plane and left, okay? And it's phenomenal to watch the will of the Ukrainian people. And if I'm NATO, I'm worried about what do we need to do to protect civilians? Because if the civilians don't have food, right, or they don't have basic ways to live and keep the fight going from a sustainment standpoint, they'll quit. I think the other vulnerability is the Russians are not maneuvering at night. If I was turning on my TV right now, I'd be like, oh my God, here comes the Russians. Like, no, nothing's happening tonight because they don't.
No, they're just lobbing artillery.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So nothing's happening against tonight. So when I wake up in the morning, I'll say, okay, what happened? But tonight it's over. If you're watching right now, Kev's not getting taken tonight. So I start to think about where are the vulnerabilities with the Russians, and the ability for us to provide them accurate intelligence, right? IO operations and intelligence, and sort of getting their ability to do certain things at night that the Russians can't do. I mean, you can tip the scales. I also think that this is a 21st century war. Everybody in the United States has actually participated in this war, right? Everybody in the United States who knows that Russia's losing this war, it's important for them to say that because Ukrainians are watching. Like, this is a 21st century battlefield where if you're NATO, you're like, how do I win the strategic IO war here? How do I continue to create NATO support for what the Ukrainian population is doing? How do I prevent a humanitarian crisis? And what are the tactical advantages that we can provide the Ukrainians that give them, some operational ability to defend themselves? And I think, those are 3 different lines of effort that I feel NATO is working on, to be honest. I mean, there is a unity amongst NATO right now that's unprecedented. My 4 years in Germany, I know you were in Germany too, Markos, back in the day.
3 years.
But I still watch German soccer on Saturday mornings, and there's these kids in Germany that are like, oh yeah, they're 18 and we root for the same soccer team, but they're like, why is the American army still here? And they're Green Party people. And I'm like, y'all don't remember what it was like to have the Soviet army on your border. Like, you don't remember what it was like because they grew up after the fall of the Berlin Wall. They messaged me this week, like, are you guys going to defend us if we get nuked? I'm like, yes, we are. But but you have to remember, these kids who grew up in Europe post Berlin Wall have grown up under a different environment, Markos. It's not like when you were in Bamberg. So this is the first time they've dealt with this threat, this reemerging threat. So I've not seen this type of unity in Europe since Kosovo, to be honest.
Yeah, I was in I was assigned to a cav unit patrolling the Czech border, and I remember I went back a few years ago with my family, and we went to the Museum of the Cold War in Berlin, and there's a piece of the Berlin Wall, and I'm like, holy crap, my life is history. Like this is
Yeah.
like some bygone era, and suddenly it's not so bygone anymore.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
really isn't. Now, both of you have cautioned against any NATO military involvement, correct?
Yeah, I
Yeah.
actually I get like some of these folks are like, oh, no fly zone, no fly zone. But I gotta tell you, like, you don't want this to be a US Russia intervention. Like right now, the Ukrainians are winning on their own. They're actually winning this war. It's not about casualties. Look, we lost 20 Rangers in Mogadishu in 93, but we won the battle. Like because you take casualties or there's loss doesn't mean you're not winning. I mean, General Grant took casualties, but he beat Robert E. Lee. So I don't think you want to bilateral this thing at all. And I get the operational standpoint of a no-fly zone. But right now, the Russians are getting run without it. They are legitimately getting run without it. And I'm not sure you want to see that type of escalation at this moment. Because now, does that cost you your NATO coalition? And to the Biden administration's credit, when we were pushing to send more NATO troops to Eastern Europe a month ago, they were very concerned about this looking like a U.S.-Russia conflict. I'll give them credit for that. As all the heat that they take, that is an extraordinarily important dynamic because the strategic power for NATO is unity, is strategic unity. So I think you want to preserve that. And I'm not sure if you do a no-fly zone, you get that. Now it's different if they take a NATO country or they touch a NATO country. Totally different problem set at this point.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, what are you going to do to enforce that no-fly zone? You're really going to shoot down some Russian MiGs?
It's an act of war.
Yeah. And they got nuclear weapons. And I actually think that saber rattling is what scared off Poland and Slovakia from handing over their MiGs to Ukraine. And it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I mean, it really changed. Nuclear weapons changed the game. I mean, and when you've got a guy that you don't know is, he's already sort of saber rattled with it a couple times, and it's like, is this guy serious or not? And then you've got a lot of Russia watchers, a lot of experts in this area who are warning us to take him seriously. So I will, and so it certainly should give everyone pause when we talk about a no-fly zone and engaging, Russian forces directly, because it can think about, people think they have this idea of how something's going to go, but once the shooting starts in any type of conflict, your ability to control it degrades by the hour or minute. And so once this thing it could spiral out of control very quickly.
Yeah, the Biden administration has been very rational about it, and there's a lot of high emotions, and the images coming out of Ukraine are so impactful. But yeah, they're clearly doing the right thing, and we don't have time to talk about the geopolitical consequences. But you're right, Belarus, wants nuclear weapons. Japan just asked the U.S. to station nuclear weapons in Japanese soil. Everybody's starting to realize these nukes actually they are kind of handy for national security reasons, and it's problematic, if we're looking for non-proliferation of nuclear weapons, but it's just sort of the reality. So we're almost out of time. Jon, I know VoteVets is doing some work, trying to raise some money for the Ukrainian people. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, if people go to our Twitter feed, there's a link in there to get a sticker. It says, "I don't need a rod, I need ammunition." And we'll be pushing out another sticker tomorrow that's Russian warship, go fuck yourself. So we're doing these stickers. The money gets donated into our Vet Boys Foundation, and then we hand out 97% of it or 98% of it directly to a nonprofit that's working on the ground in Ukraine that we sort of validated called CARE. So I think we raised like 25 grand in the first 2 hours. But if anybody wants to go to our Twitter feed, it's a donation of any level to get the sticker. And then they'll end up getting our emails and that type of stuff. They can join the organization overall. But just go to VoteVets on Twitter and you'll see the sticker giveaway. And we just thought the Zelensky quote was profound. It was equivalent of General McCullough being surrounded in Bastogne saying nuts. We're in a country where we have a president, who attacked our own capital essentially, or motivated people to do that. And the idea that Zelensky, his life is on the line after what we went through in Afghanistan with Ghani, is absolutely incredible. And the quote is, it'll live in certainly Ukrainian lore, but in global lore for generations.
Yeah, the Russian myth has fallen, but now there's a new emerging Ukrainian
Right.
myth, and that was you couldn't have scripted it better. I mean, it's like out of a Marvel movie. It's perfect. Brandon, your post-military career, you've actually focused on helping out conflict and post-conflict areas. Can you tell us a little bit about what you're working on?
Yeah, sure. So 4.5 years ago, we founded Rakuten Tea Company, and this is a tea company based here in Dallas. We promote peace and economic development by importing premium loose leaf tea from post-conflict countries, some of which have recently become conflict countries again, unfortunately. But yeah, that's what I'm focused on right now is helping farmers in post-conflict countries reach U.S. consumers with their tea.
Jon and Brandon, thank you so much for giving us your entire hour. That was incredibly generous of you all, and that was incredibly informative. Thank you so very much.
Markos, I enjoyed it. It was great. I mean, I'm getting frustrated watching all the cable news shows right now. So it was great to come on here and talk with you guys. So
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. So thanks to Walter Einenkel for producing this show. Thanks to Kara and the entire Daily Kos Brief team for everything that they're working on. And thank you, the viewer and the listener, for everything that you do as we fight for a better America and a better world. And oh, by the way, before we go, if you're watching on video, I have my Ukraine shirt. And in case you don't know, the Ukrainian flag it's yellow and blue, and the yellow symbolizes your fields of grain or wheat. And then the blue is obviously the sky. And that always sort of kind of gets me, given what you're going through. So I'm so happy to be wearing my Ukrainian flag t-shirt right now in solidarity. And thank you, everybody, for everything that you're doing for our country and for our world. See you next week.